All right. So I talked last week about the trip that we made and how difficult it was to find these trees. Well, as I mentioned, I think last week, we found a much easier way out. So this time we went back, but we went back with a couple of younger guys than
I wasn't one of
myself.
those younger guys. It was.
Oh, yes, you were. Um, but we got a little smarter, and we got a couple of buddies, my son-in-law on the far right, Jeremy Locke, and then a good friend who's very interested in creation research, Wade Delk. And Wade brought his side by side, which could handle 6 people. Of course, I followed on my open 4-wheel drive, and it was snowing on us, so it was a little bit of a cold drive. But we brought along a lot of equipment. You'll see in the back end of his side by side, we have an old wagon for being able to take all of our gear in, because we brought all sorts of gear with us. Because our hope was to be able to maybe find some nice pieces that were out on the ground that we could take back. And it was a long trip, even after the 12 miles down a road and 4 miles down a gravel road, and then get into the side by side, and it's a 3 or 4 mile ride up the hill. We still had a long hike, about a mile and a half, 2 miles, pulling this wagon. So it was nice having a couple of young guys, and they worked hard to free us up to where we wouldn't wear ourselves out. But we got there, and we were still fresh, so we got to work making measurements. And Joe's going to talk about some of this, but we measured the height of these, the diameters, the orientation, and Joe may talk a little bit about just the density of these, because you find these. There are 4 of these over, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 meter length of bank face. There's 4 of these, but you can walk these banks for a long while and there'll be none. On down from this location, we went down, I don't know, good little ways without anything. And then all of a sudden, there's another cluster of them. We measured diameters, but the diameter depends upon the orientation. And Joe's going to talk more about that. So it was a very productive time. We also got to do a lot of filming, a lot of documentary of what we did and what we found. You can see us here measuring the diameter in different directions on these. Joe even's going to talk about the 3D scans that we were able to make. And we also found some pieces down in the mud, as you can tell, and hauled them out. I'll show you one of those here in just a minute, because then it was quite a trip to get these back out of there. You can see how wet and nasty it is down in these trenches that are dug by the coal mining that was done way in the past. And now that they've excavated the coal out, it leaves these trenches that fill with water. So it's not a small task, and but it's good to have some young, strong guys there to pull them out. And trust me, by the end of the day, they were exhausted because we made one last stop. Last week, we talked about one of these stumps that we found, and I was determined for us to get this one out of there because, I'm the old guy. I wasn't having to do all the work. We had some young guys with us. We dug this one out. Now, what's interesting, if you see on the picture on the top left, is the roots. Now, Craig may be able to talk about this, but as I recall, trees have branches and trees have roots. But every one of these polystrate trees, the base, if you were able to see the base, looks like this. The roots are just snapped off. And you can see that. I'm pointing to one right there, and you can see it in the upper left. Every root is just snapped off. And if you remember these trees that I showed you, there's no branches on these trees. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll show you some of these, because we do occasionally find the roots, and the roots are like this. They are oriented, they are squashed, they'll be flattened. They are squashed roots, right? You can see how they're squashed, whereas the main stalk of it will be much more rounded. And I've got one small piece of the big pieces that they brought out. Oh my gosh. And you can see they can be quite large. This is the small one. That big one that we saw as a stump, we worked and worked and worked. We dug it up out of the mire, placed rocks underneath it, set it in that sled, and we couldn't budge it. We're going to have to go back another day and try and get it. That thing was massive, but it's a beautiful piece.
All right, and just taking over here for a moment, there's two other aspects before we get into these sort of discussions of them as a fossil forest and as a polystrate tree and what that means. You have two other main points which you can make an argument for these trees. The first one is a case for living fossils. The second one is a case for good to bad to worse as an opposite of evolution, right? Remember the living fossils that Diane was talking about? Now you find these polystrate trees all over the world. Many of them are these sort of hollow lycopod trees that we have here in Tennessee, but some of them, in fact, quite a few of them are hardwood trees, right? Or hardwood as in even softwood versus hardwood. They are not hollow inside. It's actually petrified wood. Case in point, the Newcastle down in Australia trees are pine trees. They're so well preserved you can identify them as pine trees. Diane mentioned the Araucaria trees, right? The southern conifers, same thing. You find them over in Arizona here in the United States. You find them up in places in Scotland, in the United Kingdom. So many of these trees are indeed a hard-centered tree, whether it be a softwood like a pine or a hardwood, but it's a hard-centered tree as opposed to these hollow lycopods. And many of these trees have a case for living fossils. Araucaria, perhaps most classically, they are definitely southern conifers. They haven't changed. They haven't evolved in some of the cases, supposedly over 300 million years. When it comes to these things, these lycopods, we don't have any kind of lycopods alive today that are as big as this. The same is true of these ones that Glenn held up, and this is a fairly worn example, but we got a really, really lovely big one. But you can probably just about see the sort of the striations on there and the little segments. Now, these little segments and sort of lines are very, very distinctive. We do still have these alive today. They're called horsetail rushes or mare's tail rushes. And, well, today they're spindly little things, right? Tiny little rushes. At most, they get up to a meter or so tall, and they're really, really thin, only a centimeter kind of thick. And these are the fossil ones, and they're identical in every single way, bar one feature. The fossil ones are much, much bigger. Now, this is a small example of an equisedum, right? Equisedum from the equine. It's a horsetail rush, right? The equisedums used to get enormous. You find them in the fossil record as basically huge trees, using trees in the definition of a great big stem, right? Okay. Now, they are a living fossil in one sense because they certainly have reproduced after their kind, but there is a change there. But it's not a change which is seen as an evolutionary change. Evolution says you start down here and over millions of years, you build yourself onwards and upwards, right? Single-celled creatures continually evolve all by themselves with no outside intelligence until eventually these single-celled creatures evolve into an ape-like ancestor and on until mankind. Now, do we see change in the fossil record? For sure we do, but it's never an uphill change, it's always a downhill change, and you can see where the loss of information has actually happened. I mean, we've done the megalodon shark on here many, many times, right? You hold up your modern great white shark, you hold up your megalodon tooth, right? You are dealing with what is in effect the same shark. In fact, until recently, they've recently changed the name because it didn't fit with the evolutionary assumptions. But just until the last couple of years, they were always regarded as being the same genus, Carcharodon, right? The great white shark and the megalodon. And it didn't fit in with the evolutionary assumptions, so they changed it. But I still believe, as John does, that the great white shark and the megalodon shark are the same kind. They're the same created kind. They used to be big, now they're little. And you can go to the Houston Museum of Natural Science and they have a model of the megalodon shark and they have a model of the modern great white shark, and they say, look how much sharks have evolved. They used to be big, now they're little. No, you're using the wrong term here. This hasn't evolved. They've devolved. They've gone downhill, just like the Bible said they would in the beginning once man had sinned. They would reproduce after their kind, but the world after sin would go from good to bad to worse. That's what we see. Now, with these trees that you have in Tennessee, not only do you see the living fossil, as in after its kind, perhaps after its kind is a better term. 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, God says that living organisms will reproduce after their kind. And you find even though that lycopods used to be huge, great big trees, today they are spindly little things. We call them tassel ferns, right? And that equisedum used to be huge trees. Today they're thin little reeds, but they have reproduced after their kind. They've just gone downhill in the process. They've lost the information to be great big trees. So yes, you have a clear piece of evidence for after their kind, but you also have a piece of evidence of good to bad to worse, that biblical concept which flies in the face of evolution, which says things should be going the other way round. Okay, so back to these trees then as a concept and what we're really looking at here. We're going to have a look at a little video now. It's about 4 minutes long. We filmed it. It's sort of going to be, Lord willing, part of a slightly larger documentary that we're pulling together, but just have a look at this little 4 minute long clip because we filmed it out there on this excursion, and it will feature me and the trees, and you'll get sort of up close and personal to them and see some of the details better than you can do just with photos. So I'm going to set that going now and sit back and enjoy. So we're in the middle of Tennessee, about 12 miles off-roading and a couple of miles hike in the middle of Morgan County, and we've got these beautiful fossil trees. And this is one of the best examples in the world of what a polystrate tree is. You see the tree, it starts way down here, it goes all the way up until it disappears into the rock face, and you can clearly see all the layers. Polystrate. Poly meaning many, like polytheistic, many gods, right? Poly meaning many, straight referring to strata or layers. This is a tree which cuts up through many, many layers, and the layers are pushed in around it. You see, this is a tree that has been buried in an upright position. But how did it get there? How did it get buried? How many years was it sitting here waiting for the layers to build up around it? Did it live and die and grow in the swamp? These are all really important questions that polystrate trees present. Now we're back at the Morgan County polystrate trees, and where you find one tree, you're bound to find many. We've got 1, 2, number 3 little one, and then that big one that we looked at earlier just beyond. So they're all in one kind of an area. And then just a little bit further down they disappear, and then more turn up further down. So we've clearly got trees that are in groups. But did they grow in groups and then die and get buried in groups, or were they swept into position? Well, that's a really good question, and there are certain aspects of this tree and these groups of trees that can give you a good indication as to what's going on here. For starters, you can dig down as deep as you want, you'll find no roots. In fact, you'll often find entire stumps just lying here, right? And their roots have been ripped off. These trees didn't live and die and get buried here. These trees have been ripped up from somewhere else. You can also know this because dig down as deep as you want to, you find no soil. Lots of coal, and coal's supposed to form in a swamp, but you can go to swamps today and the material is just breaking down and turning into soil. It's not even turning into peat. So something doesn't line up there either. So there's no soil down below, there's no roots down below. In fact, notice one thing about these trees, there's no branches either. You see, you often find these trees with their branches stripped, with their roots torn up, and they're buried in position like this. And there's one final piece to this puzzle. If you stand back and notice, all these trees are leaning in the same direction. They're all leaning in a north to south type direction. You see, these trees have been swept into position. And you can look at the bases, and these trees have been squashed. They've been squashed in the direction that the water is flowing, and the sediment is pushing up against them. Lived here, died here, buried here. No, these trees have been swept into position. But then you shouldn't be surprised. This is the Pennsylvanian deposits, those Carboniferous deposits as we call them in England, and you can find them around the world, and they all have the same fossils in it. They all have the same flood-buried polystrate trees. So we're just clearing out down here at the base of this tree, trying to give it some more exposure. And what actually are these trees? Because you get lots of different types of polystrate trees, from pine trees to all sorts. Well, these are known as lycopods. Some of them are the lepidodendrons, the big scaly branch trees. Some of these are more sort of simpler lycopods, but they're one great big hollow plant. We still have them today. They are considered in the same family as club mosses. So it's a hollow plant that's been infilled with sediment, and you can still see some of the bark pattern on the outside. So even though these are an infill, this is a tree that has been buried. This is a tree that has been buried in an upright position, and it's been preserved beautifully. This is not a tree that sit around for millions of years waiting to be slowly buried. If you want to get a tree buried like this, you need to bury it and fossilize it before it has time to rot away. And it's not even hard and woody inside, so you've got even less time than a normal tree. It's all about getting the right process, and this process was a big process because this is a huge deposit that goes around the world and is filled with these polystrate trees.
That's good.
Okay, so you have these trees that are there that you can go and see, and you remember we mentioned orientation. They all tend to be leaning in one particular direction, and we took the compass out and measured it all the way up, going from a sort of a northeast southwesterly kind of orientation. And you also have sediment displacement. So the sediment is hitting the tree at this side, and then the sediment is suddenly jutted up higher on the other side. You can see the direction in the way that the sediment is going. And you've also got these trees that are squashed. You take the diameter, and on that big tree, just to give you a perspective, right, if you follow the way that the strata is clearly flowing, that the water is clearly flowing, maybe I've given something away there, but you can actually follow the way that the direction of the strata is going. You can measure it at the bottom. It's about 35 centimeters. You measure it from front to back, right, and you see that it's squashed because front to back it's over 50 centimeters. So the round tree has become squashed as the sediment has pushed up on it. And this is not a completely unique phenomenon, by the way. Most of these trees, particularly the hollow lycopod types, you can see evidence of both strata displacement as well as this squashing. And in fact, sometimes it's not even the hollow lycopods. You can find examples of fossil wood, as in completely hard woody wood, right, that has also been squashed. And you can run experiments. I know that Vance Nelson has done this, and maybe John can comment afterwards, but you can run experiments at just how much pressure is needed to squash trees. It is enormous amounts of pressure. Now, kind of marry this up with the fact that these trees are supposed to have grown there, they're supposed to have died there, they're supposed to have slowly been buried over millions of years. In fact, Craig, we were just talking before we came live, Craig found an article from, I think it was the 1950s, where not only did it say there are only 3 examples of fossil forests around the world, well, now we know there are hundreds of the things, right? But they also said that this is something that's supposed to have slowly and gradually, in, I think the phrase was countless eons of time or countless millennia, have turned into a fossil. Okay, think about it for a second. You've got these trees that have clearly been ripped up. They've been stripped. They've been transported along because you can see the direction that the strata is flowing. The strata is displaced. They've been squashed very quickly, and they've been buried. Not one of these pieces of observable evidence marries up at all with the idea that these got slowly buried over vast periods of time. I mean, countless millennia. Well, just take 1 millennia, 1,000 years. What are the chances a tree is going to be left after that? The answer is none. We do find some occasional bog, we call them bog, I suppose you'd call it more like swamp over here, but you can find the bogwood, right, in places where you have the peat beds, and occasionally wood can last for over 1,000 years, but it needs to be trapped in an oxygenous environment. You have no evidence that there was peat beds or bog beds or anything like this. You have the coal, which is pure at the bottom. You have the trees setting up, and they're completely surrounded with the strata pushed right up to the tree, covered in this shale. So you have no evidence that it slowly lived there, died there, and slowly got buried over vast periods of time, but lots of evidence that these trees were ripped up, transported into position, and buried very quickly indeed.
I also find it interesting that they were filled with sediment. So if they hadn't been filled with sediment, you would expect it would have been completely much more squashed. But also, that sediment color indicates that it wasn't a reduced environment.
Yeah. Now, we're just going to deal with one final aspect of this before we throw it open to questions and then come back to John. I'm going to talk about the size of these beds, because John's going to talk a bit about Jurassic fossils, but these trees that you find here in Tennessee are part of the Pennsylvanian coal beds. Now, Pennsylvanian Carboniferous, yes, I'm sure you've heard us talk about it before. We named the beds first. We called them Carboniferous because they're full of carbon. By we, I mean the English, right? You find that in fact, you go and back enough into history, you find that the word geology was invented by the Bishop of Durham, and the area around Durham is full of these carboniferous beds. It's where the coal seams are, right? Carboniferous, full of carbon, full of coal. Now, the Americans, being the rebels that they are, wouldn't possibly go with the English terms, so they took the Carboniferous. We had Upper and Lower Carboniferous. They took Upper Carboniferous and Lower Carboniferous and named it Pennsylvanian and Mississippian. And we like to remind people it's got nothing to do with millions of years, nothing to do with evolution. In fact, none of these rock names do. Even things like Jurassic, as Diane mentioned earlier, they're named after what their rock is made up of or where they were first studied, right? Carboniferous, named because it was full of coal. Pennsylvania, named because that's where you find the Carboniferous, right? That's where you find the coal rocks. And here in Tennessee, we are dealing with these Pennsylvanian coal beds with these trees that go vertically upright through strata. Not unique, though, because here we are in Northumberland in the United Kingdom, and you can actually see we have another polystrate tree here. It's one of these hollow lycopods again. There's the tree that I'm looking at. There it is in the geological context. It's full of the coal seams, just like you get in Tennessee. It's full of the shale, just like you get in Tennessee. In fact, in many of these locations, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the fossils, bar one sort of fact: it was a lot colder on this windy day in Northumberland, and we're on the beach, right? But these rocks, the same ones that are supposed to be in Tennessee, are supposed to be around 300 million years old. 300 in this case here in Northumberland, 318 million years old. Well, how could we actually test that? Before we even get onto the size of these beds, you have to realize that there's one very important biblical point here. Look at what we find inside these beds. Now, we've found these here in the United States in Tennessee. We've found these things here over in the United Kingdom. We've found them up in Canada. We've found them all over the world. These are fossil thorns. Loads of examples of these fossil thorns. You get them out, you clean them up, you can see them pretty clearly. And you have to ask the question, are these rocks really 318 million years old according to the Bible? What's a biblical point? I know the Bible says that these are not 318 million years old for one very simple point. You see, the Bible is a history not only of salvation and God's dealings with mankind, but it's a very real history of the world from creation to recreation. And you find that when man sinned, that thorns and thistles were one of the consequences that came onto the planet. The Bible is explicit that thorns and thistles and prickles and whatever botanical definition you want to give them, thorns and thistles are the result of man's sin. So they didn't come onto the planet until after man was on the planet. And if you find these rocks, and these rocks are full of fossil thorns, you can correctly conclude that according to the Bible, these rocks are not 318 million years old, but are less than 10,000 years old. Because if you count up the genealogies in Scripture and you count up, you get to an age of about 6,000 to 7,000 years old, 10,000 years at the max, and it flies in the face of the millions of years idea of evolution. Okay, we have these trees. According to the Scriptures, these trees, these rocks must have been buried after Adam sinned. These trees are rocks rather are full of fossil trees. Their roots have been ripped up. Where you have trees with branches, their branches have been stripped. Where you have trees with bark, their bark is often turned to coal. You find them buried with coal at the base, and the rocks around them are full of sea creatures. Mixed environments, because it's true. We've found, or John, I say we, it's a royal we. John has found horseshoe crabs buried next to these trees here in Tennessee. So you find land plants and seashells buried together. That's an indication of a flood. And how big are these rock deposits that you find here? Well, Professor Derek Ager was really the first one to point this out, and he was a great scientist because he actually went out and dug and actually went to go and see what was out there. And he made this point about the idea that these rocks slowly formed over millions of years. The Carboniferous, he said, extends in essentially the same form from Texas to the Dantes Gold Basin north of the Caspian Sea in the USSR. Well, you probably, if you're not familiar with the USSR, this book was written a few years back, but you probably know where the Dantes is because of all of the Ukraine war that was going on in the Dantes region. Well, there is the picture for you. There's Texas, there's the Caspian Sea. This amounts to some 170 degrees of longitude, and closing up the Atlantic by a mere 40 degrees does not really help at all in explaining this remarkable phenomena. What's his point? Well, you see, you have a deposit which exists in effectively the same way across the majority of the world. And they all are full of these trees. They're all full of thorns. They're all full of land plants and sea creatures mixed together. They're all full of these coal-type deposits as well. Even more remarkable, well, not only do you have clear flood deposits going from Texas to the Caspian Sea, but not too long back, they've turned up down in the western side of Australia as well. You see, we're dealing with a flood deposit which covered the entire world at one point. Worldwide flood? Yes, for sure. You see, the flood deposits are worldwide, and you can come to one very simple conclusion. You see, these Carboniferous or Pennsylvania Mississippian rocks formed after Adam sinned. We know that because they're full of thorns. They were formed under flowing water conditions. You can see that. Because of the trees, you can see that because of the mixed environments, the land plants and the sea creatures buried together. You see that because of the way the strata is flowing. It covers enormous portions of the Earth's surface, so it was a worldwide flood. You come to the correct conclusion that these Carboniferous rocks are very good evidence of having been formed during Noah's flood.